Colonel Vincent Ashworth's voice cut across the Strategic Operations Center like a blade. Someone get the janitor out of here. This is a restricted simulation, not a spectator sport. The old man in faded gray coveralls froze mid-step, mop handles still gripped in his arthritic fingers. His name tag, said Earl. What his name tag did not say, what no one in that room full of polished brass and pristine uniforms could possibly know, was that the doctrine being used in this very simulation, the strategy these officers were failing to execute properly, had been written by the man they were asking to leave. 43 officers filled the Patton Strategic Operations Center that December morning. Stadium seating curved around a massive tactical display that stretched 40 feet across the far wall, glowing with unit markers and terrain data. Below the digital display sat traditional sand tables covered with miniature tanks, aircraft, and infantry positions. The annual Winter War Games brought the best strategic minds in the military to this room every year. Careers were made here. Reputations were built or shattered in the space of a single simulation. And right now, every eye had turned to look at the elderly janitor standing near the observation entrance with a mop bucket and a confused expression on his weathered face. Ashworth descended from the central command platform, his silver eagles catching the overhead lights. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to razor creases, the kind of perfection that came from never having crawled through mud or bled in sand. He stopped 3 feet from Earl and let his voice carry so that every junior officer in the gallery could hear his contempt. Did you not understand me? Ashworth gestured toward the door. Out. Now. This exercise is classified, and you are definitely not clear to be here. Earl's hands tightened on the mop handle. His knuckles were scarred, white against weathered brown skin. He said nothing. His eyes, behind thick glasses held together with tape at the temple, tracked briefly to the tactical display behind Ashworth. Just for a moment. Then they dropped to the floor. Yes, sir, he said quietly. I apologize, sir. I was just finishing the corridor and did not realize. Captain Naomi Chun stepped forward from her position at the simulation coordinator station. Sir, if I may, he could simply stay in the corner until there is a break in the exercise. It would only be 20 minutes before we pause for recalibration. Ashworth turned his theatrical contempt on her. Captain, do you think the Joint Chiefs watching this exercise on secure feed want to see the help wandering through our strategic operations? Do you think that projects the image of competence we're trying to demonstrate? Chen's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. Earl had already begun shuffling toward the door, bucket wheels squeaking against the polished floor. But something made him pause at the threshold, something in the tone of the voices behind him, the sound of officers arguing, the sharp edge of panic beneath professional composure. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the tactical display from the corner of his eye. Red force markers were advancing across all 3 theaters. Blue force, the NATO simulation, was in full retreat on the Eastern Front. The Central Theater showed a collapsed defensive line. The Western position was holding, but barely, cut off from resupply routes. Earl's fingers found the chess piece in his coverall pocket. A white knight, worn smooth by decades of touch. He traced its edges without thinking, a habit so old it had become as natural as breathing. The simulation is broken. Ashworth's voice boomed across the room as he returned to the command platform. Red Force has been given impossible advantages. There is no way to recover these positions with conventional doctrine. A lieutenant spoke up hesitantly. Sir, what about an asymmetric approach? If we repositioned the reserve armor to create a distraction in Sector 7. Ashworth cut him off. Do you have stars on your collar, Lieutenant? Do you have 30 years of strategic experience? No. Then perhaps you should observe and learn rather than embarrass yourself with amateur suggestions. The lieutenant's face flushed red. Other officers exchanged glances but kept their mouths shut. Earl watched from the doorway. His eyes were no longer on the floor. They tracked across the tactical display with a precision that would have startled anyone paying attention. His lips moved silently, calculating angles, distances, response times. 40 years of training did not disappear simply because a man traded his stars for a mop. In the observation gallery above, a four-star general named Patricia Hawkins leaned forward her chair. She was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had clawed her way up through intelligence ranks when women in uniform were still a novelty. Her first assignment, fresh out of the academy, had been archiving classified strategic documents. She had spent 2 years reading files that most generals never saw, including the complete, unredacted files on something called the Whitmore Doctrine. Her eyes were not on the failing simulation. They were on the old janitor standing in the doorway, on the way he held himself when he thought no one was watching, on the slight straightening of his spine as he studied the tactical display, on his hands, which had stopped shaking the moment they touched that chess piece in his pocket. Hawkins said nothing, but she did not look away. Below, Ashworth was berating another officer for suggesting a flanking maneuver. The simulation timer continued to count down. Red force continued to advance, and the old janitor, who should have left 5 minutes ago, remained frozen in the doorway, watching officers twice his size and half his age fail to see what was obvious. "Move the tanks," Earl whispered to himself. "Just move the tanks." If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you are joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about hidden brilliance in unexpected places speak to you, consider subscribing. Now, let us continue. What no one in that room understood, what Colonel Ashworth could not possibly have imagined as he postured and preened before the assembled brass, was that the solution to his impossible simulation stood 6 feet away in coveralls that smelled of floor polish. A solution written by a man who had once prevented nuclear war using exactly this kind of thinking. A man the military had declared dead 15 years ago. A man who was very much alive and watching his own doctrine fail in the hands of officers who had never understood what it actually meant. Earl's hand remained on the door frame, his body half turned toward the corridor, but his feet refused to move. The chess piece pressed against his palm through the thin fabric of his pocket. He could feel its edges, the curve of the knight's mane, worn smooth by 60 years of worry. Behind him, the simulation continued to collapse. "Sector 4 has fallen," a young captain called out from her monitoring station. "Red force is pushing through the gap. We have no reserves to counter." Ashworth's response was immediate and sharp. "Then pull from Sector 6. Reinforce the line. Sir, if we pull from 6, we expose the supply corridor. The entire Western Theater becomes untenable. Then find another solution, Captain. That is why you are here. That is why we train." Earl closed his eyes. The voices faded, replaced by older sounds. Different voices in a different room, but the same panic. The same desperate scramble of men who could not see the board clearly. October 1962. The war room beneath the Pentagon. Fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered. Cigarette smoke so thick it formed clouds near the ceiling. A young major named Earl Whitmore, standing at the edge of the room, watching generals argue while Soviet ships steamed toward Cuba. He had been 32 years old, newly promoted, assigned to strategic analysis because someone had noticed that his chess rankings were not the only thing that made him unusual. He thought differently than other officers, saw patterns where others saw chaos, connections where others saw coincidence. That night, with nuclear war 13 days away, he had watched the same paralysis he was watching now. Senior officers trapped by doctrine, by training, by the assumption that the enemy would behave rationally, predictably, conventionally. Major Whitmore. The voice had belonged to a general whose name was now in history books. "You have been very quiet. Do you have nothing to contribute, or are you simply waiting for us to destroy the world before you speak up?" Earl remembered the way his throat had tightened, the way every eye in that smoke-filled room had turned to look at the young officer who had no business being there. And he remembered what he had said. "Sir, we are assuming the Soviets will respond to strength with retreat. But General Petrov does not think like that. He thinks like a chess player. He will not retreat from strength. He will look for the move we do not expect, the weakness we do not know we have." The general had stared at him for a long moment. "And what weakness is that, Major?" "Our assumption that this is about Cuba." Earl had approached the map table, his hands steady despite his racing heart. It is not about Cuba. It is about Berlin, about NATO, about forcing us to commit so heavily to one theater that we cannot respond to moves in another. If we mass our forces in the Caribbean, we leave Europe exposed. Petrov knows this. He is counting on it. The room had gone silent. The same kind of silence that filled the Patton Strategic Operations Center now, though for different reasons. Earl opened his eyes. The memory faded, but the lesson remained. 60 years later, and officers were still making the same mistake, still thinking in straight lines when the enemy thought in circles. The chess piece in his pocket seemed to grow heavier. "Maggie," he whispered, "what do I do?" Margaret Whitmore had died 15 years ago. Cancer that had started in her lungs and spread everywhere before the doctors even found it. She had been his anchor for 43 years of marriage. The woman who had held him together through every crisis, every classified nightmare, every sleepless night when the weight of what he knew threatened to crush him. Her funeral had been attended by 3 presidents, 24 generals, and intelligence chiefs from 6 allied nations. Earl had stood at her graveside in his dress uniform, accepting condolences from people who had once hung on his every word and felt absolutely nothing. She had been the reason he stayed human. Without her, he did not know how to be anything but empty. A week after the funeral, he had submitted his resignation. Not retirement, resignation. Effective immediately, he had asked that his service record be sealed, his public profile erased, his contributions attributed to committees and working groups rather than to him personally. The Pentagon had resisted. Brigadier General Earl Whitmore was a legend in strategic circles. The Whitmore Doctrine was taught at every war college in the Western world. His thinking had shaped 50 years of defensive policy. But Earl had insisted, and eventually they had agreed. A convenient fiction. Death certificate filed. Records sealed. The legend preserved while the man disappeared. He had taken a job as a janitor at the Eisenhower War College 3 months later. Close to what he loved. Invisible. No one asking him to be brilliant. No one expecting him to save the world. For 15 years, he had mopped floors and emptied trash cans and listened to young officers discuss his own doctrine without knowing he was there. He had watched them get it wrong, most of the time, had bitten his tongue so hard it bled, had whispered corrections to empty rooms after everyone went home. It was enough. It had to be enough. But now, standing in this doorway, watching these officers fail in exactly the way he had warned against 60 years ago, something inside him cracked. "The simulation is not broken," he murmured. "You are just looking at it wrong." A young lieutenant near the door turned. "Excuse me?" Earl's eyes snapped to the officer's face. Lieutenant Marcus Okonkwo. Earl had seen his file once, left open on a desk he was cleaning. Good family. Military lineage going back 3 generations. Respectful to everyone regardless of rank, including janitors. "Nothing," Earl said quickly. "I was just talking to myself." Old habit. But Okonkwo did not look away. His eyes moved from Earl's face to his hands, still white-knuckled on the doorframe, to the slight straightening of his spine that happened whenever Earl forgot to pretend he was just a tired old man, to the way his gaze kept drifting to the tactical display with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity. "Sir," Okonkwo said quietly. "Are you all right?" Earl felt the word like a knife. "Sir." Not old man. Not janitor. "Sir." For 15 years, no one had called him sir. "I'm fine," he managed. "Just an old man who stayed too long where he does not belong." He turned to leave. His hand was on the corridor wall, his first step already taken. And then Ashworth's voice rang out across the room, triumphant in its certainty. "There is no solution. The simulation was designed to be unwinnable. We have demonstrated the limits of conventional doctrine. That is the lesson here. Sometimes there is no good move." Earl stopped. His hand dropped from the wall, and something in his chest that had been quiet for 15 years began to burn. "There is always a move," he whispered, "if you know how to look." He turned back toward the room, toward the display showing 3 theaters in collapse, toward the officers who had given up, toward the colonel who had just declared victory in failure. And for the first time in 15 years, Earl Whitmore considered stepping back into the light. The simulation timer showed 47 minutes remaining. 47 minutes until the exercise officially ended in defeat. Until every officer in this room had to explain to the Joint Chiefs watching on secure feed how they had lost a scenario designed to be winnable. Ashworth seemed almost pleased by the failure. He stood at the center of the command platform, arms crossed, delivering a lecture on the limitations of strategic doctrine to an audience that had stopped listening. "This is precisely why we must evolve our thinking," he proclaimed. "The old frameworks, the legacy doctrines that we have clung to for decades, they were designed for a different era, a different enemy. What we are witnessing today is proof that we need fresh approaches. New blood, modern solutions unburdened by outdated assumptions." Earl remained in the doorway. His feet had not moved. His eyes had not left the tactical display. The old frameworks, the legacy doctrines. Ashworth was talking about his work, about the Whitmore Doctrine that had kept the Western Alliance coherent through 40 years of Cold War, about strategic principles that had prevented 3 nuclear exchanges and countless conventional escalations. And this colonel, this man who had inherited his career rather than earned it, was dismissing it all as outdated thinking. Captain Chen noticed Earl still standing there. Her brow furrowed slightly. She glanced at Ashworth, who was too absorbed in his own voice to notice anything, then crossed quietly toward the doorway. "Sir," she said softly, "you should probably go. The colonel is in a mood, and if he sees you still here, it will not go well." Earl looked at her. Chun was young, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and the careful posture of someone who had learned to survive in rooms full of men who did not want her there. Her father had been in Cold War intelligence. Earl had read that in a personnel file left on a desk. She came from a family that understood the weight of secrets. "What would you do?" Earl asked. Chun blinked. "Excuse me?" "The simulation. If you were in command. What would you do?" She glanced back at the display, then at Earl with visible confusion. "I am just the coordinator. I do not make tactical decisions." "But if you did?" Chun hesitated. Her eyes moved to the tactical display, tracking the positions the same way Earl's had. She was smart. He had known that for months, watching her work late nights when she thought the building was empty. "I would look for the move they do not expect," she said finally. "Red Force has countered every conventional response. So I would do something unconventional, something that looks like a mistake." Earl felt his chest tighten. She understood, at least partly. The seed was there. And what would that look like? Chen opened her mouth to answer, but Ashworth's voice cut across the room. "Captain Chun, is there a reason you are consulting with the janitorial staff instead of monitoring your station?" Chun stiffened. She turned to face the command platform. "Sir, I was just directing him to the exit." "Then direct faster. We have 44 minutes to demonstrate that this simulation is flawed, and I need my coordinator focused on documentation, not conversation." She nodded sharply and moved back toward her station. But as she passed Earl, she whispered something so quiet he almost missed it. "Third Armored Reserve. Kilo Sector. It has been bothering me all morning." Then she was gone, and Earl was alone in the doorway again. "Third Armored Reserve. Kilo Sector." His mind raced through the possibilities. The reserve units were positioned defensively, held back to respond to breakthroughs. Standard doctrine. Safe doctrine. The kind of thinking that Ashworth understood because it required no imagination. But if you move them forward, if you position them in Kilo Sector, which was currently a quiet zone with no strategic value, you would create what appeared to be a gap in your defensive coverage. An invitation. A weakness that any aggressive commander would feel compelled to exploit. And when they committed to exploiting that weakness, when they pushed forces through what they thought was an opening, they would find themselves overextended, exposed, cut off from support, and surrounded by units that had been waiting for exactly that moment. It was a trap, a beautiful, elegant trap disguised as a mistake. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had defined his entire career. In the observation gallery, General Hawkins had noticed the extended conversation at the doorway. She had watched Chun approach the janitor, watched them speak in low voices, watched Chun return to her station with an expression that suggested she had heard something that mattered. Hawkins reached for her tablet and pulled up the facility's personnel files. Maintenance staff, janitorial services. A list of names and photographs appeared on her screen. Earl Whitmore, age 74, hired 15 years ago. No military background listed. No education beyond high school. Emergency contact, none. She studied the photograph. An old man with thick glasses and tired eyes. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would draw attention, but something about the way he held himself. Something about the economy of his movements. The way his eyes tracked the tactical display with predatory precision, while his body language projected harmless confusion. Hawkins had spent her career learning to see what people wanted to hide, and this janitor was hiding something. She zoomed in on the photograph, on his hands specifically, on the scarring across his left knuckles that spoke of old injuries, on the way he stood, even in a posed photograph, with his back to the wall and clear sight lines to the exits. Those were not the hands of a man who had spent his life pushing a mop. Those were the hands of someone who had done hard things in hard places. Below, Ashworth was berating another junior officer for suggesting they request additional simulation parameters. His voice had taken on the particular tone of a man who knew he was failing and had decided to blame everyone else. The simulation is not the problem, Ashworth declared. The problem is that we have become too dependent on doctrine that was written by men who never had to face modern asymmetric threats. The Whitmore Doctrine, for instance. Brilliant in its time, perhaps, but hopelessly outdated now. We need to move beyond these relics of Cold War thinking. In the doorway, Earl's jaw tightened. Relics. Outdated. Hopelessly behind the times. He had heard these criticisms before. From officers who had never prevented a war. From strategists who had never sat across a table from an enemy and talked him back from the brink. From men who studied conflict as an academic exercise and had never felt the weight of knowing that one wrong word could end civilization. His hand found the chess piece again. The white knight that Anatoly Petrov had given him 60 years ago when they were both young men trying to keep their countries from destroying each other. To the only American who understood the game, Petrov had written on the base. Earl understood the game. He had always understood the game. And right now, watching these officers lose because they could not see 3 moves ahead, he felt something he had not felt in 15 years. Anger. Cold, precise, clarifying anger. Ashworth wanted to dismiss his work as outdated. Ashworth wanted to declare this simulation unwinnable while standing in a room that taught principles Earl had written in blood and sleepless nights. Fine. Earl straightened his spine, let his shoulders settle into a posture that had nothing to do with mopping floors, and took one step forward into the room. It was time to show them what outdated thinking could do. The step Earl took into the room was small, barely a foot of distance covered, but it felt like crossing an ocean. For 15 years, he had been invisible, a ghost in coveralls who emptied trash cans and mopped floors and listened to officers discuss wars they had never fought. He had built his anonymity carefully, brick by brick, until the wall between Earl the janitor and General Whitmore seemed impenetrable. One more step would begin to tear that wall down. He hesitated. His hand went to his pocket, fingers finding the chess piece automatically. The night's smooth surface grounded him, connected him to memories he had spent years trying to bury. Margaret would have known what to do. She always knew. He remembered the night he had come home from the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days of living underground, sleeping in shifts, eating food that tasted like cardboard and fear. 13 days of believing that every hour might be humanity's last. When it was finally over, when Khrushchev had blinked and the ships had turned around, Earl had driven home in silence. He had walked through the front door of their small house in Arlington at 3 in the morning. Margaret had been waiting in the kitchen, coffee cold in her hands, eyes red from days of not knowing if her husband was alive or if the world was about to end. She had not asked questions. She had simply opened her arms. Earl had collapsed into them and wept like a child. All the terror and pressure and impossible weight of those 13 days had poured out of him while she held him together. She had stroked his hair and whispered that it was over, that he had done what needed to be done, that he could rest now. "You saved us," she had said. "You saved all of us. And no one will ever know." That had been the first time. The first secret. The first weight that only Margaret could help him carry. There had been so many after that. Berlin, Prague, a dozen classified operations that would never appear in any history book. Each time, he came home hollowed out and haunted, and each time she rebuilt him with patience and love and the quiet certainty that he was doing necessary work. When she died, the weights did not disappear. They simply crushed him without her there to help bear them. The funeral had been 3 days of ceremony he barely remembered. Flags and honor guards and speeches from men who had once needed his counsel. He had stood at her grave in his dress, uniform, and felt the last piece of himself that was still human lower into the ground with her. Afterward, people had tried to help. Old colleagues, friends from the intelligence community. Even a former president had called personally. But Earl had pushed them all away. He did not want comfort. He did not deserve it. Margaret had spent 43 years married to a man who kept secrets from the world, who missed birthdays and anniversaries because of crises he could never explain, who woke screaming from nightmares he could never describe. She had given him everything, and what had he given her in return? A husband who was never fully present, a partner who was always half lost in classified darkness. She deserved better. She had always deserved better. So Earl had done the only thing that made sense to him. He had erased himself, closed the book on Brigadier General Earl Whitmore, and started a new chapter as nobody. A janitor, a ghost haunting the halls of the institution that still taught his ideas without knowing he was there. It was penance. It was hiding. It was the closest thing to peace he could find. But now, standing in the doorway of the Strategic Operations Center, watching officers fail because they could not think beyond their training, Earl felt the old weight settling back onto his shoulders. What would Margaret say if she could see him now, hiding in plain sight while the work of his lifetime was misunderstood and misapplied? She would tell him to stop being a coward. The thought hit him like a physical blow. His breath caught. His hand tightened on the chess piece until his knuckles ached. Margaret had never tolerated his self-pity. During every crisis, every moment when he wanted to give up, she had been the one to push him forward, to remind him that his gifts came with responsibilities, that hiding from what you could do was just as wrong as misusing it. "You do not get to disappear," she had told him once, during a particularly dark night in 1983 when the world had come closer to nuclear war than anyone knew. "You do not get to take what you know and bury it, because carrying it hurts. That is not how this works. You were given a mind that sees what others cannot see. You use it, Earl, even when it breaks you. You use it." He had used it. For 40 years, he had used it. And then she died, and using it without her there to put him back together afterwards seemed impossible. But maybe impossible was just another word for afraid. Earl looked at the tactical display. 41 minutes remaining. 3 theaters in collapse. Dozens of officers who had been trained on his doctrine but had never understood its heart. The Whitmore doctrine was not about positions and counterpositions. It was not about defensive lines and reserve deployments. It was about understanding that war was a conversation, a deadly, terrible conversation between opponents who were both trying to survive. You did not win that conversation by being stronger. You won it by understanding what your enemy feared, what they wanted, what they would risk everything to achieve. And then you made them think they could have it, right up until the moment you took it away. Red Force in this simulation was aggressive, expansionist, programmed to exploit any perceived weakness. The officers running Blue Force had responded with defensive posturing, trying to shore up lines and protect territory. But that was the wrong conversation. Defense invited offense. Strength invited probing attacks. The more you tried to protect everything, the more you spread yourself thin. The right move was counterintuitive. Offensive. You had to create a weakness so tempting that Red Force could not resist exploiting it. And when they committed to that exploitation, when they poured resources into what they thought was a killing blow, you closed the trap. Kilo Sector, 3rd Armored Reserve. Just like Chun had whispered. It was so obvious. So elegant. The kind of solution that looked like madness until it worked, and then looked like genius. Earl took another step into the room. Ashworth was still lecturing, still explaining why failure was actually a learning opportunity, still finding ways to blame the simulation, the doctrine, anything except his own rigid thinking. No one noticed the old janitor moving closer to the tactical display. No one saw his eyes tracking unit positions with the precision of a master chess player studying a board. No one except Lieutenant Okonkwo, who had been watching Earl since their brief exchange, and General Hawkins, who had stopped pretending to review her tablet and was now staring at the old man with an expression of dawning recognition. Earl stopped at the edge of the sand table. His reflection ghosted across the tactical display, a faded figure superimposed over glowing unit markers. "Forgive me, Maggie," he whispered. "I know I promised I was done, but I cannot watch them lose like this." He reached out and touched the glass of the display, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the hum of technology beneath his fingertips. Then he cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for the room to hear. "If you move the 3rd Armored from reserve to grid reference Kilo 79er, he said, you create what appears to be a gap in sector coverage." Every head in the room turned to stare at him, and the silence that followed was deafening. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. 4. 5. Earl stood at the edge of the sand table, his words hanging in the air like smoke. 43 officers stared at him, some with confusion, some with irritation, a few with something that might have been curiosity. Colonel Ashworth recovered first. He descended from the command platform with slow, deliberate steps, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. His face had arranged itself into an expression of theatrical disbelief, the kind a teacher might wear when a particularly slow student said something absurd. "I am sorry," Ashworth said, his voice carrying the full weight of his contempt. "Did the janitor just offer tactical advice?" Nervous laughter rippled through the junior officers, a release valve for the tension that had been building all morning. Earl said nothing. His hands hung at his sides, no longer trembling. Something had shifted inside him when he spoke. Some barrier had cracked. He could not take the words back now, even if he wanted to. Ashworth stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Earl could smell his cologne. Expensive, probably chosen to project authority. "Let me explain something to you, old man." Ashworth's voice dropped to a patronizing murmur loud enough for the front rows to hear. "This is a strategic operations simulation. These officers have spent decades studying warfare. They have advanced degrees, command experience, security clearances you cannot even imagine. And you push them up." Earl met his eyes, held them. Something in his gaze made Ashworth's smile falter for just a fraction of a second. "Yes, sir," Earl said quietly. "I push him up. Then perhaps you should return to pushing it and leave the strategy to people who understand it." Ashworth turned his back dismissively and began walking toward the command platform. The matter was closed. The janitor had been put in his place. Order had been restored. "The gap you create appears to be a weakness," Earl continued, his voice still quiet but somehow filling the room. "Red Force doctrine dictates exploitation of apparent weakness. They will commit reserves to push through what they perceive as an opening." Ashworth stopped mid-step. "And when they commit," Earl went on, "they overextend their supply lines. Their command structure becomes exposed. You coordinate a counterattack across all 3 theaters simultaneously, catching them at maximum vulnerability." He paused. The room had gone absolutely still. "It is not a mistake," Earl said. "It is an invitation." Ashworth turned slowly. His face had lost some of its color. The theatrical contempt was still there, but something else flickered beneath it. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Captain Shun sat frozen at her monitoring station. Her eyes moved between Earl and the tactical display, running the scenario in her head. Her lips parted slightly as the implications became clear. Lieutenant Okonkwo had risen from his seat in the observation gallery. He was staring at Earl with an expression of dawning recognition, the recognition of what he could not yet say. And in the upper gallery, General Patricia Hawkins had stopped breathing. She knew those words. She had read them 1,000 times in classified documents. The gap appears to be weakness. Exploitation of apparent weakness. An invitation, not a mistake. Those are not just tactical concepts. Those were direct quotations from the Whitmore Doctrine. Phrases that appeared in the original handwritten notes she had archived as a young lieutenant. Phrases that had never been published, never been taught, never been shared outside the most classified briefings. Phrases that only one person could know. Ashworth rallied. He had built his entire career on confidence, and he was not about to let a janitor shake it. That is the most absurd suggestion I have ever heard, he declared, deliberately creating a gap in our defenses, inviting the enemy to attack. That is not strategy. That is suicide. He looked around at the assembled officers, seeking allies. Several nodded along, though their nods seemed less certain than before. Sir, Lieutenant Okonkwo spoke up. With respect, should we not at least wargame the scenario? We have 40 minutes remaining. If there is any possibility the approach could work, should we not explore it? Ashworth's eyes narrowed. Lieutenant, are you suggesting we take tactical advice from the cleaning staff? I am suggesting we consider all options, sir, given the current state of the simulation. The current state of the simulation is a teaching moment. Ashworth's voice hardened. We are demonstrating the limitations of conventional doctrine. That is the purpose of this exercise. Earl watched the exchange in silence. He had said what he needed to say. The seed had been planted. Whether it grew was up to them. But Chen was not finished. Sir, her voice was calm, professional, but something in it demanded attention. I have been running the numbers on the janitor's suggestion. The janitor has a name, Okonkwo said quietly. It is Earl. Chen nodded slightly. On Earl's suggestion, if we reposition 3rd Armored to Kilo 79er, Red Force's predictive algorithms will identify the gap within 6 minutes. Based on their established behavior patterns, they will redirect at least 2 battalion-strength elements to exploit the opening. Ashworth's jaw tightened. And then we lose sector coverage entirely. No, sir. Chen pulled up a new display, her fingers moving quickly across her console. If we preposition our remaining reserves along these coordinates, we create a kill box. When Red Force pushes through the apparent gap, they walk directly into overlapping fields of fire. We collapse on them from 3 sides while their forces are overextended. She looked up from her screen. Sir, the math works. It should not work, but it does. The room shifted. Officers who had been smirking at the janitor were now studying the tactical display with furrowed brows. The scenario Chan described was unconventional, counterintuitive, and it made a strange kind of sense. Ashworth stood very still. His career had been built on never admitting error, never showing weakness, never allowing subordinates to question his judgment. Everything in his training screamed at him to dismiss this absurdity and reassert control. But the Joint Chiefs were watching on secure feed. And if there was even a chance that this ridiculous suggestion could salvage the simulation, that someone else's idea could steal credit that should be his, he needed to control the narrative. Fine, he said through clenched teeth. Run the scenario. But when it fails, and it will fail, I want it documented that I allowed this deviation only to demonstrate its foolishness. He turned to Earl with a thin smile. And you, stay right there. I want you to watch what happens when amateurs try to play at war. Earl nodded slowly. Yes, sir, he said. I will watch. But there was something in his eyes that made Ashworth's smile waver. Something cold and patient and utterly unafraid. The eyes of a man who had seen the end of the world and talked it back from the brink. The eyes of someone who already knew exactly how this was going to end. Chen's fingers flew across the console. The tactical display shifted, unit markers repositioning according to the scenario she was building. 3rd Armored Reserve began its movement toward Kilo 79er, leaving the gap that Earl had described. 37 minutes remaining on the simulation clock. Earl stood motionless at the edge of the sand table, watching the display with an intensity that seemed at odds with his faded coveralls and taped glasses. His lips moved slightly, counting, calculating, seeing patterns that no one else in the room could see. In the observation gallery, General Hawkins had pulled out her secure phone. Her fingers trembled slightly, as she typed a message to her aide. Priority request. Full personnel file on maintenance staff member Earl Whitmore. Include photograph comparison with archived imagery from Whitmore doctrine files. Classification level Sigma. She hit send and returned her attention to the scene below. The old man had not moved, had not spoken since Ashworth's dismissive challenge. But something about his stillness was wrong. It was not the stillness of submission. It was the stillness of a predator waiting for its moment. Hawkins had spent 40 years in military intelligence. She had interrogated enemy combatants, recruited double agents, and run operations in countries that officially did not exist. She knew how to read people, and everything about this janitor screamed that he was not what he appeared to be. On the main display, Red Force algorithms processed the new Blue Force positions. 6 minutes, Chen had predicted. 6 minutes until the enemy recognized the gap and moved to exploit it. It took 4. Red Force is responding, one of the monitoring officers called out. They are redirecting elements from sectors 3 and 5 toward the Kilo corridor. Ashworth stood rigid on the command platform, arms crossed, jaw set. He was waiting for the failure, counting on it. His entire career depended on being right, and being right meant this absurd gambit had to collapse. Earl watched the red markers converge on the gap. 2 battalion strength elements, just as Chun had predicted. Aggressive, hungry, seeing an opportunity too good to pass up. That was the thing about aggressive commanders. They could not resist an open door. It went against every instinct they had. More Red Force units repositioning, another officer reported. They are committing reserves to the push. Chun looked up from her console, catching Earl's eye across the room. There was a question in her expression, a silent request for confirmation that this was supposed to happen. Earl gave her the smallest nod. Ashworth saw the exchange. His eyes narrowed. What was that? He demanded. Are you communicating with the janitor now, Captain? Sir, I was simply confirming that the scenario is developing as projected. Red Force is behaving exactly as Earl predicted. As the janitor predicted, Ashworth corrected. And they're about to tear through our lines and prove that this entire exercise was a waste of time. But even as he spoke, something was changing on the display. Red Force had pushed through the gap. Their lead elements were now deep in Blue Force territory, racing toward what they believed was an exposed command structure. The aggressive move that should have won them the simulation. Except they had pushed too far, too fast. Sir, Okonkwo's voice was tight with sudden understanding. Look at their supply lines. The display showed it clearly now. Red Force's rapid advance had stretched their logistics beyond sustainable limits. Their lead elements were kilometers ahead of their support. Their command structure, in its eagerness to exploit the gap, had moved forward into an exposed position. They had walked directly into the kill box. Chun, Earl said quietly. Now, Chun hesitated for just a fraction of a second, looking to Ashworth for authorization. But Ashworth stood frozen, staring at the display as if he could not comprehend what he was seeing. Execute the counterattack, Chun ordered. The Blue Force reserves that had been prepositioned along Earl's coordinates came alive. Converging from 3 directions simultaneously, they closed on the overextended Red Force elements like a fist. Contact on 3 fronts, a monitoring officer reported. Red Force lead elements are taking heavy losses. Red Force command structure is exposed, another added. They cannot retreat without abandoning their forward units. Ashworth finally found his voice. This is not possible. The simulation parameters do not allow for this kind of reversal. But the display told a different story. Red Force was collapsing. Their aggressive push had become a death trap. Every instinct that had made them dangerous was now working against them. Earl watched in silence. His face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, just the quiet focus of a man completing a task he had done many times before. In the observation gallery, Hawkins received a response to her priority request. She opened the attached file and felt her heart stop. 2 photographs, side by side. On the left, the personnel file image of Earl Whitmore, maintenance staff, 74 years old, thick glasses, faded coveralls, unremarkable. On the right, a classified photograph from 1962, A young major standing at a map table in an underground war room. Same jawline, same eyes, same hands, now aged and scarred but unmistakably the same. The caption beneath the classified image read, Major Earl T. Whitmore, Strategic Analysis Division, October 1962. Cuban Missile Crisis Response Team. Hawkins looked from the photograph to the old man standing at the tactical display below. The old man whose suggestion was currently winning an unwinnable simulation, whose strategy was being executed in real time by officers who had no idea they were watching history. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He is alive." She stood from her chair, drawing curious glances from nearby officers. Her legs felt unsteady. Her mind raced through implications that grew more staggering with each passing second. The Whitmore Doctrine was not just written by a dead legend. It was written by a man who was standing in this room right now, wearing a name tag that said Earl and holding a mop he had not touched in 20 minutes. She began moving toward the stairs that led down to the main floor. She needed to get closer, needed to see his face when she said the name that had been classified for 15 years. Below, the simulation continued its collapse. Red Force was in full retreat across all three theaters. Blue Force was advancing, exploiting the chaos that Earl's single suggestion had created. And Colonel Ashworth stood on his command platform, watching his career crumble along with the enemy positions on the screen. "This is wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "The simulation must be malfunctioning. Run a diagnostic." "The simulation is functioning normally," Chen reported. "All parameters within expected ranges." "Then explain how a janitor just won a scenario that we spent 3 months designing to be unwinnable." No one answered, because no one had an answer that made any sense. No one except General Patricia Hawkins, who was descending the stairs with a classified photograph clutched in her hand and a name on her lips that she had not spoken aloud in 30 years. Checkmate. The call sign of a legend. The call sign of a man who was supposed to be dead. Earl could have left. The simulation was turning. His suggestion had worked. There was nothing more he needed to prove. But his feet remained planted at the edge of the sand table, watching the display as Red Force positions collapsed one by one. 29 minutes remained on the clock, and Blue Force was advancing across all three theaters with a momentum that would have seemed impossible 30 minutes ago. He should have felt satisfaction, or pride, or at least relief. Instead, he felt exposed, naked, like a man who had spent 15 years building walls around himself and had just watched them crumble in the space of a few sentences. Ashworth was pacing the command platform, barking orders that no one was following. His voice had taken on a desperate edge, the sound of a man watching his carefully constructed world fall apart. "Run the scenario again. There must be an error in the algorithms. This result is not possible with standard doctrine." "Sir," Chen's voice was carefully neutral. "The scenario is running correctly. The result is a direct consequence of the tactical adjustment implemented at Earl's suggestion." "Stop calling him Earl." Ashworth spun toward her, face flushed. "He is the janitor. He cleans toilets. He does not win war simulations." "And yet," Okonkwo said quietly from the observation gallery, "he just did." Ashworth's head snapped toward the young lieutenant, his mouth open to deliver what would certainly have been a career-ending reprimand. But before he could speak, a new voice cut across the room. "Colonel Ashworth, stand down." General Patricia Hawkins had reached the main floor. She moved through the rows of monitoring stations with the controlled urgency of someone who had just discovered a fire and was trying not to cause a panic. In her hand, she clutched her tablet with the 2 photographs still displayed on its screen. "General," Ashworth straightened instinctively, his anger replaced by the automatic deference of a career officer. "I was just addressing an irregularity in the simulation results." Hawkins ignored him. Her eyes were fixed on Earl. She stopped 6 feet away from him, close enough to see the details she had missed from the observation gallery. The scar on his left hand, faded but still visible. The way he stood with his weight balanced, ready to move in any direction. The slight bulge in his coverall pocket where something small and heavy rested. The chess piece. She knew about the chess piece. It was mentioned in the classified files. A gift from a Soviet general after back-channel negotiations that had prevented nuclear war. Earl met her gaze. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition of recognition. An understanding that his 15 years of anonymity were about to end. "General," he said softly, "can I help you with something?" Hawkins was silent for a long moment. The room had gone quiet around them, officers sensing that something significant was happening even if they did not understand what. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 34.5253 degrees north, she said. 69.1725 degrees east. Earl's face went pale. Those were coordinates. Specific coordinates. Coordinates that appeared in only one place in the entire military archives. The location of a NATO command bunker in Brussels. The bunker where a young major named Earl Whitmore had spent 13 days during the Cuban Missile Crisis, developing the strategies that would eventually prevent nuclear war. The coordinates that were tattooed on his left forearm, hidden beneath 15 years of grime and the long sleeves of his coveralls. "How do you know those numbers?" Earl asked, his voice barely audible. "Because I've spent 30 years studying the man who wrote them." Hawkins took a step closer. "I archived his files when I was a lieutenant. I have read every document he ever produced. I have taught his doctrine to 3 generations of officers." She held up her tablet, showing the 2 photographs side by side. "And I have looked at his photograph every day for 3 decades, wondering what kind of mind could see what he saw. What kind of man could carry what he carried." Earl looked at the photographs, at his younger self, confident and certain, standing in that underground war room with the weight of the world on his shoulders. At his current self, old and tired, and wearing coveralls that smelled of floor polish. 2 versions of the same man. One celebrated, one invisible. "You are supposed to be dead," Hawkins said. "General Earl Thaddeus Whitmore. Call sign checkmate. Author of the strategic doctrine that has guided Western defense policy for 60 years. The military declared you deceased in 2009. Earl closed his eyes. The room seemed to spin around him. "I asked them to," he said quietly. "After Margaret died. I cannot carry it anymore. Not without her. So you became a janitor." Hawkins shook her head slowly, disbelief and awe mixing in her expression. "You wrote the playbook for modern strategic warfare, and you have been mopping floors in the building where we teach it. I wanted to stay close." Earl's voice cracked. "It was all I had left. The ideas. The work. Even if no one knew it was mine." The room had gone absolutely silent. Officers who had been monitoring the simulation were now frozen at their stations, staring at the old janitor who was apparently a dead legend come back to life. Ashworth stood on the command platform, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as the implications became clear. He had spent the morning publicly humiliating one of the most decorated strategic minds in American military history. He had demanded that the author of the Whitmore Doctrine leave the room while officers failed to properly execute his own strategies. He had called him to help. "General Whitmore," Hawkins said formally, "on behalf of the United States Army, I must ask, are you willing to confirm your identity?" Earl opened his eyes, looked at the tactical display where his suggestion was still winning the unwinnable simulation, looked at the officers who had dismissed him as a cleaning man, looked at the chess piece in his pocket, the gift from an enemy who had become something like a friend during those 13 impossible days in 1962. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. "You do not get to disappear. You do not get to take what you know and bury it." He had buried it for 15 years. Buried himself along with it. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Earl reached down and slowly rolled up his left sleeve. The fabric caught on old scars, on weathered skin that had not seen sunlight in years. And there, faded but unmistakable, was the tattoo. Coordinates, a date, and beneath them, in small precise letters, a single word. "Checkmate." The room did not breathe. "My name," Earl said quietly, "is Brigadier General Earl Thaddeus Whitmore, United States Army, retired. Call sign checkmate. And I believe I was told to leave this room about an hour ago." He looked directly at Ashworth. "I decided to stay." The silence that followed Earl's declaration seemed to stretch into eternity. 43 officers stood frozen at their stations. Monitors beeped softly, tracking a simulation that no one was watching anymore. The tactical display continued to show blue force advancing, red force in retreat, but every eye in the room was fixed on the old man with the rolled-up sleeve and the faded tattoo. Ashworth's face had gone the color of old paper. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The confident officer who had commanded this room 30 minutes ago had been replaced by something smaller. Something broken. General Hawkins broke the silence. "General Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying the formal weight of military protocol. "This is an extraordinary situation. I need to verify your identity through official channels before we proceed." Of course. Earl's voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in 15 years. "The verification protocols have not changed since I helped design them. Service number 7742063E9. Security clearance Sigma Black, though I assume that has been deactivated. Primary biometric is a retinal pattern registered at Fort Meade in 1978. Hawkins was already typing on her tablet, initiating the verification request. Around her, officers had begun whispering to each other. The words spread through the room like wildfire. "Whitmore. The Whitmore. The doctrine we studied. He has been here the whole time." Lieutenant Okonkwo descended from the observation gallery, moving toward Earl with an expression of wonder on his face. "Sir," he said, "General, I wrote my thesis on your work. The asymmetric response protocols. The strategic flexibility doctrine. I have studied your thinking for years." Earl looked at the young officer, saw himself, 60 years ago, standing at the edge of rooms full of powerful men and wondering if anyone would listen. "What did you conclude?" Earl asked. Okonkwo hesitated. That the doctrine was brilliant but incomplete. That there were elements missing from the published versions. Gaps that suggested the full framework was never declassified. A faint smile crossed Earl's weathered face. "You are correct. The published doctrine is approximately 60% of the original work. The rest remains classified because it deals with scenarios that the public was never meant to know we prepared for. Nuclear first strike responses," Hawkins said quietly. "Counter-escalation protocols. The strategies we developed for wars that would have ended civilization." Earl nodded. "Wars we prevented by being prepared to win them. That was always the paradox. You have to be willing to destroy everything in order to save anything." The verification request chimed on Hawkins's tablet. She looked at the screen, and her breath caught. "Confirmed," she said. "Biometric match through archived records. Brigadier General Earl Thaddeus Whitmore. Status officially listed as deceased since November 2009. Clearance level being reinstated pending security review." She looked up at Earl. "You really are him." "I really am," Earl said, though some days I wondered if that man had died along with the official record. It felt easier to believe he had. Captain Chun had risen from her monitoring station. She approached slowly, her eyes moving between Earl's face and the tactical display behind him. "Sir," she said. "General, the simulation. Your suggestion. It worked because you knew exactly how Red Force would respond. You designed the doctrine that predicted their behavior. I designed a framework for understanding aggressive strategic thinking," Earl corrected gently. "The simulation's AI is based on patterns I identified 60 years ago. Human nature does not change as quickly as technology. An enemy that sees weakness will always try to exploit it. The key is controlling what they see." She nodded slowly. The gap was never real. It was a perception, a trap disguised as an opportunity. "Exactly." Earl's voice took on the cadence of a teacher, a rhythm that felt both familiar and long forgotten. "War is not won by the strongest force. It is won by the clearest vision. You must see not just what is, but what your enemy believes, what they fear, what they cannot resist. And then you use that vision against them." The room had drawn closer, officers gravitating toward Earl like planets around sun. The man they had dismissed as cleaning staff was speaking with an authority that transcended rank or uniform. Only Ashworth remained on the command platform, isolated, watching his career unravel with every word the old janitor spoke. This is absurd. His voice cracked across the room, desperate and thin. One tattoo. One lucky guess. That does not prove anything. Anyone could have researched those coordinates. Anyone could have studied the doctrine well enough to suggest that maneuver. Hawkins turned to face him. Her expression was ice. Colonel, the biometric verification has confirmed his identity. General Whitmore's retinal pattern is on file with the highest classification level the military maintains. It cannot be faked. Then the records are wrong. Ashworth was grasping now, reaching for anything that might save him. He died 15 years ago. Everyone knows that. This is some kind of elaborate fraud. Earl watched Ashworth's desperation with something that might have been pity. He recognized the fear beneath the bluster. The terror of a man who had built his entire identity on a foundation that was crumbling. I understand your doubt, Earl said quietly. In your position, I would doubt as well. He reached into his coverall pocket and withdrew the chess piece. The white knight, worn smooth by 60 years of touch. He held it up so the light caught its surface. This was given to me by General Anatoly Petrov of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces. October 1962. We played chess for 3 nights while our governments decided whether to end the world. He inscribed the base himself. Earl turned the piece over, revealing the tiny Cyrillic letters carved into the bottom. To the only American who understood the game. He extended his hand toward Ashworth. You are welcome to examine it. The inscription has been authenticated by 3 separate intelligence agencies. It is mentioned in classified briefings that you do not have clearance to read. Ashworth did not move, but General Hawkins did. She stepped forward and took the chess piece from Earl's hand, examining it with the careful attention of someone handling a historical artifact. I have seen photographs of this, she said softly. In the archives, it was listed among General Whitmore's personal effects. Disposition unknown after his death. She looked up at Earl. You kept it all these years. It was all I had left at that time. Earl's voice faltered slightly. That and Margaret. And then she was gone too. The room fell silent again. Not the stunned silence of revelation, but something deeper, sadder. The silence of people recognizing grief they could not fully understand. Hawkins returned the chess piece to Earl. Their hands touched briefly, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. The legendary strategist who had outthought superpowers was still, beneath everything, a tired old man who had lost the person he loved most. General Whitmore, she said formally, I believe we have some decisions to make about how to proceed. But first, I need to address something more immediate. She turned to face the command platform, where Ashworth stood alone, small and diminished. Colonel Ashworth, you are relieved of command of this exercise, effective immediately. Please report to my office at 1400 hours to discuss your conduct today. Ashworth's face went white. General, I had no way of knowing who he was. Anyone would have made the same assumptions. Hawkins's voice could have frozen steel. You dismissed a strategic solution because of its source rather than its merit. You mocked and humiliated a man based on his appearance. You declared an exercise unwinnable rather than consider perspectives outside your own experience. Those failures have nothing to do with whether you knew his identity. She let the words hang in the air. They have everything to do with who you are as an officer. Ashworth looked around the room, searching for allies, finding none. Every face had turned away from him. Every officer who had laughed at his jokes about the janitor now found somewhere else to look. Without another word, he descended from the command platform and walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed in the silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The door closed behind him with a soft click. And Earl Whitmore stood in the center of the room that taught his doctrine, surrounded by officers who were finally seeing him for who he really was. The door had barely closed behind Ashworth when a commotion erupted near the main entrance of the Strategic Operations Center. An elderly man in a worn civilian coat was arguing with the security officer stationed at the door. His voice carried across the room, thin but insistent, cutting through the murmur of officers still processing what they had witnessed. I'm telling you, I know him. The old man's voice cracked with emotion. I served with him for 12 years. I was his aide-de-camp. You have to let me through. Earl turned toward the sound. His heart stopped. The man at the door was 82 years old, stooped with age, supporting himself on a cane that trembled with each gesture. His hair was white and sparse, his face mapped with wrinkles earned through decades of service. But Earl would have recognized him anywhere. "James," he whispered. "Colonel James Kavanaugh, retired." The young captain who had been assigned as Earl's aide in 1973 and had never left his side until the day Earl disappeared. The man who had stood beside him through 3 administrations for international crises and 1 funeral that had broken them both. The man Earl had abandoned without a word 15 years ago. Hawkins gestured to the security officer. "Let him through." Kavanaugh pushed past the guard before the words had finished leaving her mouth. He moved through the rows of monitoring stations with a speed that belied his age, his eyes fixed on Earl, tears already streaming down his weathered cheeks. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to touch, close enough to confirm that what he was seeing was real. "You son of a bitch," Kavanaugh said, his voice breaking. 15 years. 15 years I thought you were dead. "Jim." Earl's voice was barely audible. "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Kavanaugh's cane struck the floor. "Sorry? I gave the eulogy at your memorial service. I stood in Arlington and talked about your legacy while they folded a flag that I knew was meaningless because there was no body, no proof, just a death certificate and a classified file. I know. I kept waiting for you to reach out. For years, I kept waiting, checking dead drops we had established decades ago, watching for signals only you would notice end." Kavanaugh's shoulders shook. "I told myself you must have had a reason, that you were on some final mission, that you would come back when it was safe." Earl closed his eyes. The guilt that had lived in his chest for 15 years threatened to overwhelm him. "There was no mission," he said quietly. "I just could not face it anymore. Not without Margaret. So you let everyone who loved you think you were dead." "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them. An admission, an apology. An acknowledgement of a choice that could never be fully justified. Kavanaugh stood in silence for a long moment. The room around them had gone still. Officers watching a reunion they did not fully understand between 2 old men who had once carried secrets that could have ended the world. Then Kavanaugh stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Earl. The embrace was fierce despite their age, the grip of a man who had found something precious that he thought was lost forever. Earl stiffened for a moment, unaccustomed to human contact after so many years of isolation. Then his own arms came up, clutching his old friend like a lifeline. "You absolute bastard," Kavanaugh whispered into Earl's shoulder. "I'm so glad you're alive." They stood like that for a long time. 2 old soldiers holding each other in the middle of a room full of strangers who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something sacred. When they finally separated, Kavanaugh wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked around the room, taking in the tactical displays, the assembled officers, the evidence of a simulation in progress. "What happened here?" he asked. "Why is everyone staring at you?" "I gave them some tactical advice," Earl said. "It turned out to be useful." Kavanaugh's laugh was wet with tears. "Tactical advice? You could not help yourself, could you? 15 years of hiding, and you still could not watch them get it wrong without saying something." "They were losing," Earl said simply. "And they did not have to." Hawkins stepped forward, extending her hand to Kavanaugh. "Colonel Kavanaugh, I am General Patricia Hawkins, Commandant of the War College. I understand you served with General Whitmore." 12 years, Kavanaugh confirmed, shaking her hand. "The best years of my career. He taught me everything I know about strategic thinking, and about being a decent human being, though he would never admit to that part." Earl looked away, embarrassed by the praise. "Colonel," Hawkins continued, "I need to understand the situation fully. General Whitmore's death was officially recorded 15 years ago. His personnel file indicates natural causes, but clearly that record is false. It was his request," Kavanaugh said. "After Margaret's funeral, he came to me. Said he needed to disappear, that he could not carry the weight anymore without her. He asked me to help with the paperwork, and then he asked me to let him go." He turned to Earl. "I should have refused. Should have made you get help instead. But you were so broken, Earl. I had never seen you like that. Not during the missile crisis. Not during Berlin. Not even during the close calls that kept us both awake for months afterward. Losing Margaret did something to you that no enemy ever could. Earl nodded slowly. She was the only one who knew all of me, the strategist and the man. Without her, I did not know how to be either one. So you became a janitor, Kavanaugh said, in the building that teaches your own work. It was the only way I could stay close. The only way I could still feel useful, even if no one knew it was me. Around them, officers had begun to whisper again. The story was spreading. The legend of the Whitmore Doctrine was taking on new dimensions. Not just a brilliant strategic framework, but a love story. A tragedy. A ghost who had haunted his own legacy for 15 years. Chin approached cautiously. General Whitmore. Colonel Kavanaugh. I apologize for interrupting, but the simulation is still running. We have 18 minutes remaining on the clock. Earl looked at the tactical display. Blue Force was advancing steadily, but the victory was not yet complete. There were still decisions to be made, still moves to execute. He looked at Kavanaugh, at Hawkins, at the room full of officers who were waiting to see what he would do. For 15 years, he had hidden from this responsibility, had convinced himself that his time was over, that younger minds should carry the burden he had borne for so long. But standing here now, surrounded by the work of his lifetime, he felt something stirring that he had thought was dead. Purpose. General Hawkins, Earl said slowly, with your permission, I would like to see this simulation through to completion. Hawkins studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. The command platform is yours, General Whitmore. Earl looked at the platform where Ashworth had stood just minutes ago, where officers had failed to execute strategies he had written 6 decades earlier. He straightened his spine, let his shoulders settle into a posture that had nothing to do with mopping floors. And then Brigadier General Earl Thaddeus Whitmore, call sign checkmate, walked toward the command platform to finish what he had started. Earl ascended the command platform with steps that seemed to shed years with each rise. The hunched posture of the janitor straightened into something harder, sharper. His hands, which had trembled on the mop handle, now hung steady at his sides. The transformation was visible to everyone in the room. This was not an old man in coveralls climbing a few stairs. This was a general returning to his battlefield. Chun, Earl said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that needed no volume. Current status across all theaters. Chin's fingers flew across her console. Eastern Theater, Blue Force has pushed Red Force back to their original starting positions. Central Theater, enemy command structure is in disarray following the kill box engagement. Western Theater, stalemate broken, Blue Force advancing along 3 axes. Earl studied the tactical display, his eyes tracking patterns that lesser strategists would need hours to perceive. 16 minutes remaining on the simulation clock. Red Force still has uncommitted reserves in sectors 9 and 12, he observed. Their AI will attempt a counteroffensive once it calculates that our advance has overextended. Okonkwo spoke up from his position near the sand table. Sir, should we consolidate our gains? Pull back to defensible positions? Earl shook his head slowly. That is what they expect. That is what conventional doctrine would dictate. And that is precisely why we will not do it. He turned to face the room. Officers who had spent their careers studying his work were now watching him apply it in real time. The Whitmore Doctrine is not a set of rules, he said. It is a way of seeing. You do not win by following a formula. You win by understanding that your enemy is also trying to win. They have plans. They have expectations. They have assumptions about what you will do. Victory comes from violating those assumptions while exploiting theirs. He pointed to the tactical display. Red Force expects us to consolidate. Their reserves in sectors 9 and 12 are positioned to strike when we pause. So we do not pause. We accelerate. Accelerate? Shin looked uncertain. Sir, our supply lines are already stretched. Supply lines matter when you intend to hold territory. Earl's eyes gleamed with an intensity that had nothing to do with age. We do not intend to hold territory. We intend to end this. He began issuing orders. Each command was precise, surgical. Units repositioned not to defend what they had gained, but to threaten what the enemy could not afford to lose. 3rd Armored, push through Sector 11 toward the Red Force command nexus. Do not engage defensive positions. Bypass them. 2nd Mechanized, feint towards Sector 9 to fix their reserves in place. Air assets, I want continuous reconnaissance on their supply corridors. When I try to reinforce the nexus, I want to know before they do. Officers scrambled to input the commands. The tactical display shifted, Blue Force units moving in patterns that seemed chaotic until the underlying logic became clear. Kavanaugh had moved to stand at the base of the command platform, watching his old commander work with an expression of wonder and grief combined. This is how it always was, he murmured to Hawkins. He sees the whole board. Not just what is happening, but what will happen. What must happen? On the display, Red Force was responding to the new threat. Their reserves in Sector 9 moved to intercept what they believed was the main thrust. Their command structure began repositioning, trying to stay ahead of the Blue Force advance. Exactly as Earl had predicted. They are committing their reserves, Chen reported. Sector 9 forces are moving to engage our feint. Earl nodded. Now we show them what a real attack looks like. 3rd Armored, execute. Full speed toward the command nexus. Do not stop for anything. The room held its breath as the simulated tank units surged forward. They bypassed defensive positions that would have slowed them, ignored threats that conventional thinking would have demanded they address. They drove straight for the heart of the enemy's command structure with a recklessness that bordered on madness. But it was not madness. It was vision. Red Force Command Nexus is in range, an officer reported. They are attempting to withdraw, but their retreat routes are compromised by their own repositioning. Earl's voice was ice. End it. On the tactical display, Blue Force units converged on the enemy command structure from 3 directions simultaneously. The kill was swift and decisive. Within 4 minutes, the simulation registered a complete collapse of Red Force command and control capabilities. The automated voice of the simulation system echoed through the silent room. Exercise concluded. Blue Force victory. Total time to resolution, 47 minutes. Enemy command structure eliminated. Enemy forces in general retreat across all theaters. No one moved. The simulation that had been declared unwinnable. The exercise that Ashworth had insisted was designed to demonstrate the limitations of conventional doctrine. It had been won in less than an hour by a man in a janitor's coveralls. Chen was the first to speak. That was the fastest decisive victory in the history of the Winter War Games. The previous record was 3 hours and 12 minutes. Earl said nothing. He stood on the command platform, looking at the display that showed his victory, and felt nothing like triumph. He felt tired. He felt old. He felt the weight of 60 years of strategic thinking pressing down on shoulders that had carried too much for too long. Hawkins ascended the platform to stand beside him. General Whitmore. That was extraordinary. It was necessary, Earl said quietly. They were losing, and they did not have to. He turned away from the display, turned to face the room full of officers who were staring at him with expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. Let me be clear about something, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. What I did today was not magic. It was not genius. It was simply the application of principles that every person in this room has studied. The difference is that I wrote those principles so I understand what they actually mean. He paused, letting the words sink in. The Whitmore Doctrine is not about positioning units or calculating logistics. It is about understanding that war is a human endeavor, fought by human beings against human beings. Machines can calculate. Algorithms can optimize. But only a human mind can truly understand another human mind, can predict what an enemy will do not because of probability tables, but because you understand what they want, what they fear, what they cannot resist. He looked at Okonkwo, at Chun, at Kavanaugh, standing below, at Hawkins beside him. That understanding does not come from reading documents or running simulations. It comes from experience, from loss, from carrying the weight of decisions that determine whether people live or die. His hand found the chess piece in his pocket. General Petrov gave me this because we understood each other. Two men on opposite sides of an existential conflict, both trying to keep our countries from destroying everything. We could have been enemies. Instead, we played chess and talked about our children and found a narrow path between annihilation and survival. He held up the white knight so everyone could see it. This is what the doctrine is really about. Not winning wars, preventing them. Understanding your enemy well enough to find the move that lets everyone walk away. The room was silent. Officers who had spent their careers studying abstract principles were hearing them explained by the man who had lived them. And Earl Whitmore, standing on the command platform he had never expected to occupy again, felt something he had not felt in 15 years. He felt like himself. The aftermath of the simulation victory rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Within minutes of the exercise ending, Hawkins' secure phone began buzzing with messages from the Pentagon brass who had been watching the feed. Within an hour, word had reached the Joint Chiefs. By the end of the day, the story of the janitor who won the unwinnable war game would be classified at the highest levels, discussed only in secure rooms by people with clearances most Americans did not know existed. But in the immediate moment, Earl stood on the command platform, surrounded by officers who did not quite know how to process what they had witnessed. A legend had returned from the dead. A janitor had defeated the best strategic minds in the military. The man who wrote the playbook had shown them how little they understood it. Okonkwo approached the platform first. His eyes were bright, his voice unsteady. General Whitmore, "Sir, I have studied your work for 8 years. I thought I understood it." He shook his head slowly. "I did not understand anything." "You understood more than most," Earl said gently. "You asked the right questions. You saw the gaps in the published doctrine. That kind of thinking is rare. But it never would have made that move. The tank reposition, the deliberate gap. I would have played it safe, and we would have lost. Playing it safe is the most dangerous strategy of all." Earl descended from the platform, his joints aching from standing so long. Safety is an illusion in strategic conflict. The only real safety comes from being unpredictable enough that your enemy cannot afford to attack. Chun was waiting at the base of the platform. She had printed something from her console and held it out to Earl with both hands, a gesture of respect that transcended rank. "Sir, the final analysis of the simulation. Your strategy achieved victory with 34% fewer casualties than any previous successful resolution. It was not just faster, it was cleaner." Earl took the paper, scanning the numbers without really seeing them. Casualties. Even in simulations, the word carried weight. Every number represented a life that would not go home, a family that would receive a folded flag instead of a living son or daughter. "That was always the goal," he said quietly. "Not just winning. Winning in a way that leaves enough pieces on the board to build peace afterward." Hawkins had descended from the platform as well. She stood nearby, watching Earl interact with the young officers, a complex expression on her face. "General Whitmore," she said when there was a pause in the conversation, "we need to discuss what happens next. Your status, your security clearances, the implications of your return." Earl looked at her. For a moment, the weariness showed through. 15 years of hiding had left marks that one morning of revelation could not erase. "I did not return, General. I was discovered. There's a difference. Nevertheless, you are alive. You possess knowledge that remains relevant to national security. The Pentagon will want to debrief you. The intelligence community will have questions. There are protocols for situations like this, though I admit none of them anticipated a deceased strategist working as maintenance staff." Earl almost smiled. "I imagine the paperwork will be complicated." "The paperwork will be a nightmare," Hawkins agreed. "But that is not my primary concern." She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Earl could hear. "My concern is you, General. You disappeared because you could not carry the weight anymore. Because losing Margaret broke something in you that you did not know how to fix. I understand that. I respect that. But now you have been exposed, and the world is going to want things from you again. I need to know if you can handle that." Earl was silent for a long moment. He looked around the room, at Okonkwo, who was already discussing the simulation with fellow officers, gesturing excitedly at the tactical display. At Chun, who was fielding calls from Pentagon analysts hungry for data. At Kavanaugh, who had settled into a chair near the wall, watching Earl with the quiet patience of a man who had waited 15 years and could wait a little longer. "I do not know," Earl admitted. "For 15 years, I convinced myself that I was done, that I had given everything I had to give and there was nothing left, that the world did not need me anymore." He touched the chess piece in his pocket, but standing on that platform, seeing the patterns, making the moves, it felt like breathing after holding your breath for so long you forgot what air tasted like. Hawkins nodded slowly. "Then we take it one step at a time. No pressure, no demands, just options." Before Earl could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. A group of officers in dress uniforms was entering the Strategic Operations Center, led by a man whose stars marked him as someone of considerable authority. Admiral Jonathan Pierce, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The room snapped to attention. Even Earl straightened instinctively, decades of military discipline overriding 15 years of pretending to be civilian. Pierce walked directly toward Earl, ignoring the other officers, his eyes fixed on the old man in coveralls with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He stopped 3 feet away. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Pierce extended his hand. "General Whitmore, I was a lieutenant during the Berlin crisis of 1987. My unit was positioned at Checkpoint Charlie when the situation escalated. We were 12 hours from shooting war." He paused, his voice thickening. "Your back-channel communication with the Soviet commander prevented that war. You saved my life and the lives of everyone in my unit. We never knew your name. We just knew someone had found a way through." Earl shook the offered hand. The Admiral's grip was firm, but his fingers trembled slightly. "I remember that night," Earl said. "It was closer than anyone knew. We were all holding our breath." Pierce nodded. "And now I find out that the man who saved us has been cleaning floors in our own building for 15 years. He shook his head. "The irony is not lost on me, General." He turned to address the room. "What happened here today is classified at the highest level. No one speaks of this outside secure channels. General Whitmore's identity and status are matters of national security." Then he turned back to Earl. "But within those channels, General, I want you to know that you have options. Advisory positions, consulting roles, teaching opportunities. Whatever you want, whatever you are willing to give, we will find a way to make it work." Earl looked at the Admiral, at Hawkins, at Kavanaugh, who had risen from his chair and was watching with tears in his eyes again, at the room full of officers who were seeing him, truly seeing him for the first time. "What I want," Earl said slowly, "is to stop hiding. Beyond that, I do not know yet. 15 years is a long time to be invisible. I need to remember what it feels like to be real." Pierce nodded. "Take whatever time you need, General. But know this." He glanced around the room at the young officers who would carry the future of strategic thinking. "What you did today, what you taught these officers in a single morning, that matters. Your doctrine was never just words on paper. It was always meant to be lived. And today, they got to see what that looks like." Earl felt something shift in his chest. A weight lifting, a door opening. For 15 years, he had believed that his usefulness was over, that he had nothing left to offer except clean floors and empty rooms. He had been wrong. And for the first time since Margaret's funeral, the future looked like something other than an endless gray corridor of days to be endured. It looked like a beginning. 6 months later, Earl stood at the front of a lecture hall in the Eisenhower War College. The room was full, every seat taken. Officers from 4 branches of service, analysts from 3 intelligence agencies, and a handful of Allied military observers who had requested special permission to attend. He no longer wore coveralls. The faded gray had been replaced by simple civilian clothes. A button-down shirt, dark slacks, comfortable shoes that were not held together with tape. He had resisted the suggestion that he wear his old uniform. That man felt like someone else, someone he was still learning to remember. Behind him, a screen displayed the title of his lecture series, Strategic Thinking in an Uncertain World, Principles and Applications. Below the title, his name, Brigadier General Earl T. Whitmore, United States Army, retired. The first principle of strategic thinking, Earl said, his voice carrying easily through the room, is this. Your enemy expects you to be smart, so be smart in unexpected ways. He paused, letting the words settle. For 60 years, I have studied conflict. I have watched nations rise and fall. I have seen brilliant strategies succeed and flawless plans fail. And the single most important lesson I have learned is that war is not a math problem. It is a conversation between human beings who would rather not die. He touched the chess piece in his pocket. He still carried it, would always carry it. General Petrov understood this. We were enemies by every definition that mattered. Our countries had enough weapons pointed at each other to end human civilization several times over. And yet, when we sat across that table in 1962, we discovered that we wanted the same thing: to go home to our families, to watch our children grow up, to find a way through that did not require destroying everything we loved. The room was silent. Officers who had studied abstract theories of deterrence were hearing about the human reality beneath them. That is what I want to teach you, Earl continued. Not formulas, not doctrines. Understanding. The ability to see your opponent as a person with fears and hopes and pressure from above and families waiting at home. Because when you understand that, you can find moves that let everyone survive. After the lecture, students lingered to ask questions. Earl answered each one with patience, drawing on decades of experience to illuminate points that textbooks could only approximate. Chen was there. She had been promoted to major and assigned to the War College's Strategic Analysis Division. She waited until the other students had dispersed before approaching. General, that was remarkable. As always. Earl smiled. You do not need to attend every lecture, Major. I'm sure you have more important duties. There is nothing more important than this, sir. She hesitated. I wanted you to know. The simulation from that day. It has been incorporated into the advanced curriculum. They call it the Whitmore scenario now. Required study for all senior strategic officers. Earl shook his head slowly. They should call it the Chun scenario. You were the one who saw the potential. I just pointed at a map. You did considerably more than that, sir. The door to the lecture hall opened, and Kavanaugh entered. He moved more slowly these days, his cane a constant companion, but his eyes were bright. Earl, there is someone here to see you. Earl frowned. I do not have any appointments this afternoon. This one did not make an appointment. Kavanaugh's expression was strange, a mixture of wonder and something Earl could not quite identify. She came a very long way. She? Kavanaugh stepped aside, and a young woman entered the lecture hall. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair and sharp features that seemed somehow familiar. She carried a folder pressed against her chest like something precious. General Whitmore? Her accent was faint but unmistakable. Russian. Yes. My name is Anna Petrov. She took a breath. My grandfather was Anatoly Petrov. Earl's hand went to his pocket, to the chess piece that had lived there for 60 years. Anatoly, he whispered. He passed away 3 years ago. Anna's voice was steady, but her eyes glistened. Before he died, he asked me to find you. He said to tell you that the game is not over yet. She held out the folder. Earl took it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, handwritten in shaking Cyrillic script. He could not read the words, but he recognized the handwriting, remembered it from notes passed across tables in rooms where the fate of the world hung in the balance. Beneath the letter was a photograph. 2 young men seated at a chessboard. One American, one Soviet, both barely 30 years old, both carrying the weight of civilizations on their shoulders, both trying to find a way through. He kept that photograph by his bed for 50 years, Anna said. He would look at it every night and say a prayer. For you, for the world you both saved. Earl's eyes filled with tears. He had not wept since Margaret's funeral, had locked that part of himself away, along with everything else he could not bear to feel. But now, looking at this photograph, remembering a man who had been his enemy and his partner, something like a friend, he felt the walls crumble. He said you would still be playing, Anna continued, that you would still be making moves he did not expect. He wanted you to know that he never stopped being grateful, that the world his grandchildren inherited exists because 2 men chose chess over war. Earl traced the faces in the photograph. His own, Petrov's. So young, so frightened, so determined to find another way. Tell your grandfather, Earl began, then stopped. Remembered that Anatoly was gone, that another piece had been removed from the board. He took a breath. Thank you, he said, for coming all this way, for carrying his words. Anna nodded. She reached into her pocket and withdrew something small. A chess piece. A black knight, worn smooth by decades of touch. He wanted you to have this. To complete the set, Earl took the black knight, held it alongside the white one. Two pieces from opposite sides of a board, reunited after 60 years. The game is not over, he murmured, as long as someone remembers how to play. That evening, Earl stood at the memorial wall on campus. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He held both chess pieces in his palm. Maggie, he said softly, I think you would be proud. I stopped hiding. I started teaching again. And I remembered something you always try to tell me. He placed the black knight at the base of the memorial, next to a name he visited every week. A colleague lost during the Cold War. A friend who never came home. You said that surviving was not betraying the dead, that the best way to honor them was to keep living, to keep trying, to keep making moves. He straightened slowly, his joints protesting, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. I think I finally understand what you meant. Behind him, footsteps approached. Kavanaugh, coming to walk him back to the faculty housing he had finally agreed to accept. Ready? Kavanaugh asked. Earl looked at the memorial one last time, at the names of those who had not made it, at the chess piece he had left as tribute to an enemy who had become something more. Yes, he said. I think I am. They walked together toward the buildings where young officers were studying doctrines Earl had written, preparing to face challenges he could not imagine, carrying forward a legacy he had almost let die in the shadow of grief. The game continued, and Earl Whitmore, after 15 years of hiding, was finally ready to play. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that wisdom can hide in unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel and share in the comments. Have you ever seen someone underestimated who turned out to be extraordinary? Right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember, every person you pass has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching.